Hello and welcome to the Big Vag Energy Podcast. This is Chess, and this time I truly cannot believe where my audacity has taken me. I read this book earlier on this year and subsequently listened to the audiobook just because I was so enthralled by the facts and the findings. And when I really like a book or I really like a person, I like to listen to their voice saying the story. I'm not going to say story, it's not a story, just reading the book, reading their words. So that's what I did. And then, as I always do, one of my biggest mottos, you guys know, is don't ask, don't get. So I decided to message Marianne, the author of this amazing book, who is incredible, by the way. Firstly, I was absolutely floored by her vocabulary and how calm and collected she is and how knowledgeable she is. I want to be her when I grow up, basically. So I decided to ask her, and she very kindly said yes. I'm sure she has a bajillion things to do, but she met up with me over Zoom and we spoke about the authority gap and a few other things, actually. And I'm on tour, and I had to do this in a hotel room because when Ann Seighart makes time for you, you make time for her. And I even borrowed my mic from Mark, the sound guy, and then I borrowed these headphones and this Focusrite from Ryan, and I was like, this is gonna sound great, blah blah blah. And then I plug it in, and of course, for some reason at the time, it doesn't work. So the quality is still really good between me and Marianne on the call, but I just wanted to let you guys know that's why it's going to sound different to this intro. Anyway, moving on. A little bit more about Marianne. She spent 20 years as assistant editor and columnist at The Times and won a large following for her columns on politics, economics, feminism, parenthood, and life in general. She has chaired the Social Market Foundation think tank, and she is a visiting professor at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London and sits on numerous boards. She was chair of the judges for the Women's Prize for Fiction 2022. She has also written a weekly column in The Independent about politics, economics, and social affairs, and presented NewsHour, the BBC World Service's flagship news and current affairs programme. She also has a TED Talk, which I will link below in the description, that you must watch. Quick synopsis of the book, which is The Authority Gap, Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men and What We Can Do About It. Imagine living in a world in which you were routinely patronized by women. Imagine having your views ignored or your expertise frequently challenged by them. Imagine trying to speak up in a meeting only to be talked over by female colleagues. Imagine subordinates resisting you as a boss merely because you're a man. Imagine being trolled by women on social media for daring to express an opinion. Fancy that, we have opinions. Imagine people always addressing the woman you are with before you. Now imagine a world in which the reverse of this is true. The Authority Gap provides a startling perspective on the unseen bias at work in our everyday lives to reveal the scale of the gap that still persists between men and women. Marshalling a wealth of data with precision and insight, and including interviews with pioneering women such as Baroness Hale, Mary Beard, and Bernardine Evaristo. This is a fresh feminist take on how to address and counteract systemic sexism in ways that benefit us all. This book will make you angry. That is verified by me. It will make you shake your head in disbelief. Verified by me. There I was walking the dogs. AirPods in, shaking my head. Palm to forehead. But it will also inspire you because it contains the key to addressing these problems, mapping out the measures we can take as individuals and society, both to counteract them and to see them for what they are, an irrational but tenacious product of our social conditioning. Hi, Marianne. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Big Vag Energy Podcast. How are you today?
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm very well, thank you. I hope you're well too.
Absolutely. I'm on tour and I've just tried to do this makeshift setup so that I could talk to you. And I even asked the sound man for some of his equipment, but it's not working. Of course it's not working the day I need it to work. but we'll get through this anyway because I'm very, very, very excited to have you on. So as I said in the intro, I read your book this year, and then I followed by listening to the audiobook, just because I like it when the author reads their own book. I just find that really interesting, and I like to hear your voice, basically. So, and I told you that everybody who's had a birthday recently has got that book as their birthday present, and I can't stop going on about it because I could relate to it so much. And as frustrating as I found some of the facts, I found it incredibly relatable and almost validating. So there's so many aspects to this book that have lit the fire under me to do even better than I already am trying to. So thank you.
That's great to hear. I hope you're giving the book to men as well as women, because I really want men to read this book. I don't think the world will change unless they read it too.
Absolutely. And we'll get to that because I actually have a question about asking you about men reading your book as well. Can you remember the first moment where you were first treated differently to the opposite sex and how that made you feel?
Gosh, I should think it was when I was about 2 or 3, because I have an abiding memory from childhood of hating it when my brother was allowed to do things that I wasn't allowed to do, or if I was patronised in a way that he wasn't patronised. And I still somewhere have a little handwritten note that I wrote to my father. I can't have been more than about 5 or 6, saying how unfair it was that he had allowed my brother to go into the cockpit of the plane to meet the pilot and see what the cockpit was like. This, of course, was in the era when children were allowed to do that before hijackings. And that I wasn't allowed to because I was a girl. And this note actually says, why shouldn't girls be allowed to do this too? So, yeah, I've had an abiding sense of injustice all my life, I think.
I completely relate to that. It's funny when I talk to women who have grown up with brothers, because you see that disparity so early on. And I grew up with brothers as well. So when you see the comparison and the different things that they're allowed to do, and not necessarily at the fault of the parents, because that's how they're made to believe things work. You can really see it. So I agree. It's very innate in you. You can really tell it's been there for a very long time. So where do you think your innate sense of egalitarianism comes from?
Well, my father was a great campaigner for human rights. And so we were brought up to care a lot about justice and equality. And so I think I was indoctrinated from a very early age to care about these things. And that tallied with my sense of injustice of being a girl rather than a boy. Now, I have to say, I mean, he's not alive anymore, but I have to say in his defense that he had just as high academic expectations for me as he did for my brothers. And in fact, just as high career expectations. So in that respect, I was very lucky. But I really noticed when my brothers were being treated differently, and I cared a lot about it. I also didn't like the way he treated my mother a lot of the time. And I stood up for her. So from a very early age, I was often the butt of his rage because I would point out when I thought he was being sexist or patronising. And so his anger would be turned on me instead of her.
What was his response when you wrote him that letter and said, why am I not allowed to do what my brothers are allowed to do? If he had that sense of equality and he was in that mindset anyway, what was his response to you at such a young age?
I don't remember his response to that particular letter, but I was definitely taken into a cockpit afterwards, so it must have worked.
Brilliant. I love it. Don't ask, don't get. That's what I say.
Absolutely.
Okay, so one of the most intriguing but sadly not surprising parts of your book was when you compared how the same body of work was treated when presented by male, in inverted commas, and female, in inverted commas, who was the exact same person. And this is in your TED Talk as well. So tell us more about that.
Yes, so I found this completely fascinating because if you are, say, a woman up for a job or a promotion and you're against a male rival and he gets it and you don't, you may suspect that bias was at play, but it's incredibly hard to prove because you're different people and he may genuinely be better than you. But if you talk to people who've lived as both a man and a woman, then they're exactly the same person. and they've got the same ability, intelligence, experience, personality. And if they find they're treated completely differently after they transition, then that must be because of their gender. So you have controlled for all the other variables, as scientists would say, and you've isolated the only one that matters, which is whether people see them as male or female. And so I tell a story in my book and my TED Talk about these two Stanford science professors who happened to transition in different directions at the same time. They used to meet up and compare notes over lunch. And Ben Barres, who was a neuroscientist, said once he started living as a man, he said, I've had the thought a million times, I'm taken more seriously now. He said, my work is taken more seriously. The same damned work, as he put it, is taken more seriously now that people see me as a man. And indeed, one visiting academic who didn't know his history was overheard after one of his seminars saying, oh, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work's much better than his sister's, i.e. his own work before he transitioned. And meanwhile, Joan Roughgarden, who is an evolutionary biologist, she transitioned in the other direction. And she told me that when she was still living as a man, she felt like she was just on this conveyor belt to success, and she kept getting promoted and her pay kept rising. And she was treated very respectfully. You know, when she spoke, people listened to what she said. And she said once she started living as a woman, all that changed. And she started coming up against all these aspects of authority gap behavior, which I write about, you know, being underestimated, being patronized, being interrupted and talked over, not being listened to, having her expertise challenged. She said she got personally attacked. People would say to her things like, well, you clearly haven't read the literature. She said that never happened to me when I was living as a man. And she said, to start with, I thought, well, if I'm going to be living as a woman, I'm darn well going to be discriminated against like a woman. And then she said, well, the thrill of that has worn off, I can tell you. And her conclusion, which is very similar to mine, is that men are assumed to be competent until they prove otherwise, whereas women are assumed to be incompetent until they prove otherwise. And that really is the essence of the authority gap.
It really is. And it's so hard to decide, and maybe you have an opinion on this, whether we should play into the things that with research have shown to for women or men or whatever to take us more seriously. Like you talk about, and I've done research on this as well, that I think it was presidents or people in high places, depending on the tone of their voice, how low or high it is, how tall they are, how they dress, they're taken more seriously. So even as men. So do you actually think it's beneficial for women to play into that? And I think you talked about, maybe was it Margaret Thatcher or something, who lowered her voice, or somebody, or maybe I researched that. Do you think we should play into these things to be taken more seriously? Or should we just say, you know what, screw this. This is ridiculous. Let's just power through as we are for who we are.
Well, it is completely ridiculous. But on the other hand, the world is what it is. And even I am biased against women with high voices. And I've written the book about it.
Yes.
But it's unconscious bias. It's not something we do on purpose. And this is what I keep trying to emphasize to men as well as women. You know, there's no blame attached here. We're not doing it on purpose, most of us at least. It's unconscious bias, and it's therefore very hard to change. But what we can do is notice when it manifests itself and then try to correct for it. So if I find myself listening to a woman with a very high voice who sounds a bit childish in the way that men can't because their voices break, and my reflex reaction is, doesn't sound like she knows what she's talking about, I will notice that I'm thinking that and say to myself, now stop it, listen to the content of what she's saying and don't judge her by the pitch of her voice. But you have to notice, you have to be aware of when your unconscious bias is basically playing tricks with you. And I don't think enough people are yet aware of this. And while they're still not aware, I think we probably do have to treat the world the way it is. And it does help, therefore, to have a lower voice if you're a woman. It also helps, actually, to have a lower voice if you're a man. Men with high voices aren't taken as seriously as men with lower voices. And it's really interesting that research shows that in more egalitarian countries, over the last few decades, the average pitch of a woman's voice has fallen dramatically. And in fact, if you watch black and white films from the 40s or 50s, you find that women have much higher
Of
voices and they
course.
talk in this sort of slightly submissive way, right? It happens much less now.
Yes.
Whereas in inegalitarian countries such as Japan, the women still do have much higher voices. So we have learned subconsciously to correct for this. And, women have lowered their voices because they know either consciously or subconsciously that they're going to be taken more seriously if they speak with a slightly deeper voice.
And as a great observation as it is, and I do agree that if we went forward doing that and we ended up getting ourselves into higher places because we end up being taken more seriously, etc., 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 not everybody has that accountability that you spoke about, in the sense that they say, okay, I'm noticing that I am not taking so and so seriously because of her high voice. They just won't do that, the deep digging. They just won't. So I agree, the world is the way it is, and we have to pander to that in a way, but not everybody is welcoming that accountability to actually change.
No, they're not, and I wish they would. But I think that the world is pretty much divided into three parts, and I'm thinking of men in particular, but some women also fall into these categories. Okay, so the first part are people who get this already, and they are genuinely not biased against women, and they treat women absolutely equally. They respect them equally. They listen to them just as attentively as they listen to men. And we love people like that. We love men like that. We notice immediately. We notice within a couple of minutes of meeting a man for the first time whether he's that kind of guy and whether he is genuinely just as interested in meeting us as he would be in meeting another man. We love men like that. We work much better with them. We prefer to have them as friends. We probably prefer to have them as romantic partners. Okay, so they're great. At the other end of the spectrum are the section of people, mainly men, but also include some women, who have a genuine bias against women. And it may actually be not just unconscious, but conscious. They genuinely think they're better. And I don't think they're going to read my book. And I don't think they care much about the issue. But I think there is a huge group of people in the middle. And as I say, this includes women as well as men, but I'm thinking particularly of men who have just never really thought about this. And they probably think of themselves as one of the good guys. They probably say, I haven't got a sexist bone in my body. But they just haven't yet noticed that they interrupt women more than they interrupt men, that they're more likely to be influenced by what a man says than by what a woman says, that they are likely to take up disproportionate speaking time in a meeting or in a conversation, that perhaps if they sit next to a woman at dinner, she'll ask him lots of questions, but they won't ask her any. These sorts of things, which once they become aware of their behavior, they genuinely want to change. And a lot of men have said to me, God, since I've read your book, I've started acting quite differently, and I'm really grateful for that. And the world looks quite different to me. And I now see the authority gap everywhere, and I'm trying to close it. I love those men. Aren't they great? And so if we can convert the group of men in the middle and add them to the group of men who are already great, then frankly, you've got at least 2/3 of men in the right place. And the 1/3 of men who aren't interested will become quite marginalized. So that's what I'm aiming to achieve.
Well, I'm with you on that journey, and that leads me to my next question. I'm sure you've had many conversations with men who have read your book or who refuse to read your book, or maybe have read it and still refuse to accept that this is a real issue. Tell me about the different sort of reviews and conversations that you've had with the different mentalities.
Yeah. So there have been a few men who've read it who've said, oh God, this is great. It's so interesting. You've got so much evidence and research backing it up. What can I now do to help? Those men are great. Then there's the group of men in the middle who said, wow, I had no idea. And I'm now listening to women more, and I'm really trying to bite my tongue so I don't interrupt them. And I've become much more of an ally to my female colleagues, and they're absolutely great. There are a certain number of men who challenge my expertise and just say, no, you got it wrong, your thesis is out of date, or surely this is just biologically determined. Men and women are fundamentally different, and why should they be treated equally? And I say to them, well, have you read the book? Most of them haven't even read the book. They've just heard about it. And they say, no, but, I've had years of business experience and I can tell you that you're completely wrong. To which I generally reply, well, I did actually spend about 3 years researching and writing the book. If you do read it, you will find that there is reams of evidence. In fact, there is a 30-page bibliography. And so this is not just polemic. It's not just my view. There is a huge amount of evidence to back this up. But actually, thank you so much for your reaction, because you've given me a wonderful case study for the next edition, because what you have done has proved the existence of the authority gap, because here you are telling me that I'm wrong, challenging my expertise from a position of relative ignorance. This is exactly what the authority gap is.
And still refusing to read it.
Well, they're very welcome to go off and read it. I do hope they do.
So within your research, which if they read the book, they would actually see all the benefits. Like a known fact that you mentioned is aspects such as GDP, as well as overall morale and quality of life would drastically improve if we had more equal workplaces and lives. So what do you think is stopping this from happening? Is it ego? Where is the fear of change rooted?
Okay, so I quote a brilliant philosopher called Kate Mann, who wrote a book called Down Girl in my book. And she says the trouble is that when groups of people start to lose their privilege, they don't feel leveled, they feel flattened. And so I think a lot of men feel very threatened by women starting to succeed more than they used to in the workplace, because they fear that they are going to be flattened. And I always say to them, I don't want female supremacy. I just want genuine equality between the genders. I want men and women to be equal. I don't want to be in charge of you any more than I want men to be in charge of us. I just want us to be naturally equal. But that's, what they fear is that it's a zero-sum game. And the more that we gain, the more they're going to lose. And actually, you did mention before that men can actually gain from this. And I think most of them are not aware of this. And so I have a whole chapter on what men can gain from closing the authority gap. It was going to be towards the end of the book. And then I thought, no, I'm going to bring it right up to near the front in case they don't get that far.
So they keep reading.
Yeah, exactly. Keep reading. And it was so encouraging when I was researching the book, because I had assumed that I was going to have to call on their sense of innate justice and fairness, that they should be altruistic, that they should be acting on behalf of their daughters or their female partners or their sisters. But actually what I discovered was it's in men's interest too. It genuinely is. So there is a wealth of academic research showing that both in more gender equal countries and societies, but also in more gender equal relationships, straight relationships that is, in which the man and the woman share the chores and the childcare pretty equally, not only are the women much healthier and happier, which of course you'd expect because they feel less exhausted, less resentful, they feel more part of a team, and the children are happier and healthier, they do better at school, they have fewer behavioural difficulties, they get on much better with their dads, the boys are less likely to be violent, the girls are more likely to feel ambitious for themselves. So these are all what you might expect, and they're all great outcomes. But crucially, and perhaps surprisingly, the men themselves are happier and healthier as a result. And so the research shows that they are twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their lives. I mean, that's a huge difference, isn't it? Twice as likely. They are less than half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced.
Wow.
And they tend to drink less, smoke less, take fewer drugs. They get better sleep at night. But here's the absolute clincher. They get more frequent and better sex. So guys, what's not to like about this, okay? I even thought of saying to my publisher, can we just put on the cover, how to get better sex? And maybe we'll get more men reading this book.
Try it for the next edition. But it does really bother me when you have to include the aspect of, oh, but you have a mother, and oh, but you have a girlfriend, oh, you have a daughter, to sort of get them to see the light. But if they paid attention, they wouldn't even need that comparison. They wouldn't even need that consideration. Yes, okay, you should care for women because you are related to one, because you care about one, because blah, blah, blah. But actually, because you care about yourself, it's good for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the most pivotal moment in your career that was overshadowed by gender misconception, when you were going to have a win or you had a win, but for some reason it was overshadowed by the fact that you were a woman, for example.
Well, I do remember when I was a senior editor at the Times in London, and I got invited. So Rupert Murdoch had this every 2 years. He would have this big sort of shindig for his senior executives from all over the world, and they'd come together for 3 or 4 days, and there'd be lots of sort of talks, panel discussions, that sort of thing. We were allowed to bring our spouses, and I got invited one year. This was very exciting. And so we showed up, my husband and I, at Sun Valley, Idaho. And there are all these sort of big wigs from, Fox and the Wall Street Journal and all this sort of thing. And during the course of the 3 or 4 days we were there, I counted there were 50 speakers, of whom 47 were men. And of the 3 women, one was his daughter, and one was a woman who had been invited in as a guest speaker from another company. So there was only one independently promoted woman from within News Corporation who was even allowed on the stage.
Wow.
And I remember my husband saying to me, "Emma, you're working for the wrong company." And I realized I would never be made editor of the Times. Didn't have a hope.
Right. How long ago was that?
Okay, that was admittedly some time ago. I think that was round about the turn of the millennium. But the Times still hasn't had a female editor. And this is 2024.
No, I didn't even think about that. Oh, wow. Okay, the Times. I'm sure there's many eligible, wonderful, very capable women who can be editors. So please consider that. I'm going to tag you in this. Okay, so every time I try and have this genre of conversation with anybody, men or women, it always boils down, or almost always boils down, to the fact that people say biologically and anthropologically, women are less natural authoritarians because they are the softer, more caregiving and nurturing of the sexes, and this is how it's always been.
Okay, there are so many ways to answer that question. Okay, so first of all, I would say that most of the difference between men and women is a factor of our upbringing, the way we've been brought up and socialized, rather than anything innate within us. And so there are a lot of men who, of the sort of Jordan Peterson variety, who say, we're men and women are just innately biologically different. And, you just have to look back to the Stone Age. The men were hunting the mammoths and the women were just picking the berries. And that's why men are more competitive than women, for instance.
Yeah.
Now, if that were true, then in every society, at every time, men would be more competitive than women, because it would be something that was just in our bones, in our DNA, and nothing to do with the way we've been brought up. Okay. But there is a fascinating study that was done actually by some economists of a matriarchal society in India called the Kazi, and they compared them with a patriarchal society in Tanzania, the Maasai, and they compared their competitiveness. And they found that not only were the Kazi women more competitive than the Kazi men, they were even more competitive than the Maasai men.
That's right.
So that proves that it's not something in our DNA. It's the way we're brought up and it's the way we're socialized. Okay. Now, women are socialized to be less confident, less dominant, and less assertive than men. Okay. And that happens right from very early childhood. Boys are encouraged to be sort of confident and bombastic and boastful and competitive and self-promoting. If you see them mixing with each other and bonding with each other, that's generally what it's all about. Oh, my dad's got a better car than yours, or I've scored more goals this season than you have. That's how boys bond, right? If girls tried to bond like that, they would be ostracized. We have to do the opposite. So we have to be modest and self-deprecating. We have to say, oh, my hair's so curly, I can't do anything with it. Or my bum's too big, or I wish I could lose weight, whatever it is. So girls and women actually bond through the opposite. It's through admitting vulnerability, admitting weakness, rather than boasting about ourselves. Okay. And if we do start to behave like men, and we start to show these sort of confident, assertive, and dominant leadership traits, which you need in order to be a leader, people often recoil and they feel really uncomfortable. and they start using horrible adjectives about us, and they say things like, oh, she's quite aggressive, isn't she? Or she's abrasive or strident or bossy, scary, overbearing, bitchy, ball breaking even. And these are adjectives that are never used of men, showing exactly the same character traits. And so the problem is that either we're not confident and assertive enough, in which case we're disrespected, we're not taken seriously, or we are confident and assertive enough, in which case we're often disliked. Now, you might say, well, women just need to grow thicker skin. Who cares if people like you? We do to an extent. But actually, all the research shows that likability is a much more important factor for women than it is for men when it comes to being hired or being promoted, particularly if it's men doing the hiring or the promoting. And so what we have to do, and there is a way through, it's a very narrow path, but there is a way through this apparent double bind. We have to overlay an enormous amount of warmth onto our personality in order to mitigate any hostility that we will otherwise attract for being confident and assertive and dominant if we want to be a leader. Now, all the successful women leaders I spoke to that I interviewed for this book, and as you say, I talked to a lot of them, former presidents and prime ministers, Supreme Court justices, movie directors, generals, bishops, whatever. They almost all said, what I've learned to do is to project warm authority, and that's the only way I've got through. And so I have to use humor a lot.
Okay.
I have to smile a lot. I mean, I've noticed in this era of Zoom, I'm talking to you online, and I just notice how much I smile when I talk. And I never noticed that before the pandemic, but it's something that I think we subconsciously learn to do because we realize it's the only way to keep people on side if we are being as confident and assertive as our male colleagues. And actually, the research also shows this too, that for women leaders to be accepted, they have to project warm authority. Now, that may sound inauthentic, and it's also incredibly annoying that it's a sort of burden that women have to bear and men don't. Where, Trump isn't expected to be warm, right? But Hillary Clinton was criticized for not being warm enough. Kamala Harris seems to have, got it about right, I think, from that point of view at least. But because I think women have to display more warmth and be more emotionally intelligent, the research shows they often prove to be better leaders than men. And so there are various types of leadership. And what men tend to assume is a much more hierarchical form of leadership, more directional. So it's more top down, it's more giving orders and expecting to be obeyed. Whereas women tend to indulge in what's called transformational leadership, which research has proven to be more successful than directional leadership. And so they're likely to listen as much as they talk, to be more democratic and less hierarchical, to inspire and engage their employees more. Now, men can do this too, and the best male leaders usually are also transformational leaders. But women are actually very good at this. And so I don't think there's anything sort of endemic in women that makes them bad leaders or less authoritative. It's just that they have a more complicated path to being a leader than men do.
And feeling of what you said there, and I'm sure it's happened to you and many women who are listening to this podcast. But when you are having an exchange or a conversation with a man and you come to the table with facts, maybe facts that they don't easily digest, and bear in mind we have to make ourselves and what we say and how we say it as digestible as possible to be listened to. And you are being challenged on, well, you're very used to it, on the facts that you have researched or that you're interested in, and sometimes even mansplain too. And I have to really bite my tongue because I'm a very impulsive person, I'm a very passionate person, but I have some phrases prepared in my mind to, equal the playing field if I can, because if I go on a rant, their ears are going to shut down. They are not going to listen to me, and this is going to be unproductive. So I try to calm myself down and actually get more information and maybe make them realize that what they're doing is, unfair or inappropriate. So sometimes I whip out, what evidence do you have for that claim? Or is that your personal opinion? Or do you know that what you are saying is scientifically factual? Is that your personal experience? Or are you assuming that this is applicable to the whole of society? Because we are always challenged, like you said, if it's a dude, if it's a man, chances are that you're not going to be challenged as much. So sometimes I need accessible phrases for these conversations, especially when it's a hot topic and it's a topic I'm passionate about. What do you normally say in situations like this?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Sometimes I'm just quite straightforward and say something like, I am actually quite an expert on this subject, or I do know quite a lot about this. And, people don't like that because women aren't allowed to, that will be seen as self-promotion, but it is simply a fact. If they're asking me, if they're challenging me on the evidence in my book, this is something I've devoted years of research to, and it is something I do know quite a lot about. So sometimes I do simply have to say that. One good phrase I quite like is, not my own, I'm not claiming credit for it, is anecdotes aren't the plural of data. Because quite often men will say to me, well, I've run this business for 20 years and I've never seen this problem. And I can say, yes, but actually you'd probably be the last person to notice it because you won't have been at the wrong end of it. It's much harder for men to notice instances of the authority gap because they're generally not at the wrong end of it. But when I tell you that it exists, I'm not just telling you because I've experienced it. I'm telling you because there is a wealth of academic research to back it up. And then I will give them, there are some fantastic research studies that are just so striking. One of my favorites is the researchers analyzed about 10,000 hours of US Supreme Court proceedings. You don't get much more authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice. And they found that the female justices were interrupted 3 times more than the male ones, 96% of the time by men. Now, how do you argue against that fact? So yes. I will tend to bring out, I'll just draw on a study like that, which is actually very difficult for them to dispute.
I find, obviously, and I would love to get to the point where you are, where you seem so peaceful and so confident in what you know, and of course, because you've dedicated so many years of research, and so have I, to what I believe in and I'm an activist for. But I tend to get so riled up, and I need to not do that because it overshadows the situation. Instead of educating the person I'm talking to, I end up sort of upsetting myself, and I get really frustrated with that. So I hope to get to the point where you are, where you can really feed facts in a very warm and digestible way so that they actually receive it and think about it. So I'm on that journey myself.
It's just a question of age, to be honest. I'm a lot older than you, and I felt just the same as you at your age. What I found really helped actually was having toddlers. And when my toddlers were really difficult, I found that the calmer my voice was, the easier it was to deal with them. And so I learnt not to get angry at the same time as them, if you see what I mean. I kept bringing the temperature down as they were trying to raise it. I'd never been able to do that before, and I hadn't been able to do it with other adults before, but I learned to do it with my toddlers. And I remember coming back to work, there was one particular colleague, in fact, she was a woman, who annoyed me so much. And we used to have such arguments in what's called leader conference, where it was at the Times, it was when we discussed what angle we were going to take, what position we were going to take on, the big issues of the day. And she was incredibly argumentative and really didn't like me. And before I had children, we used to have these raging arguments. And when I came back, once I learned how to deal with my toddlers, I started dealing with her as if she was a toddler. I didn't patronize her, but my voice just came down and I was much calmer. Yeah. She got more and more angry and I got calmer and calmer. And it was unbelievably effective. So I have to thank my now 33-year-old, but then 2-year-old for teaching me how to do it. It really annoyed her as well.
I hopefully eventually will have that skill, but yeah, at the moment, I find it difficult, and I feel like I need these coping mechanisms, like preparing these questions beforehand if I get challenged, and not to retaliate, but to open the floor and have conversations. And because at the end of the day, it will benefit me and women and them more than me just getting upset and frustrated. So that's a work in progress. I will hopefully learn how to streamline my energy and make it more productive. So let's lighten this up a little bit. We have a playlist where we add songs from our guests who that they pick when they're getting ready, or that they put on before they do a speech or big day at work, or just to enjoy. Do you have a song like that?
It has to be RESPECT by Aretha Franklin. Respect. Because it's all about the authority gap, right?
Fantastic. Okay, well, we'll definitely add that. I don't know why it's not on there already. Personally, I love singing that song. It gives me such power. Love Aretha, love the words in that song, of course. So yes, love it. Definitely we'll add it. And that's a song everybody knows, so perfect. And our cardinal question that we ask all our guests is, what do you think would be different if women ruled the world?
Ooh, I think we would listen to each other a lot more. I think we would collaborate a lot more. I think there'd be a lot less war. And actually, the research shows that the planet would be in a better place, that actually parliaments with more women in them pass more laws and do more to try to combat climate change. So actually, it would be a great world, wouldn't it?
It really would. And I really hope in my lifetime we do see at least a little bit of the scales being tipped. Like you said earlier, I don't expect for us to rule the world and to be totally in charge. I just want us to have the same voice, opportunities, and to make the world a better place. At the end of the day, I really do agree with you with what you said. It will be a more peaceful, more open, more considerate place. I do believe so. In my lifetime, I really hope that that does happen. Thank you so much, Marianne, for giving me your time. You are absolutely a weapon of a woman. Please keep doing what you're doing. I will do my tiny piece behind you as much as I can and keep giving this book to everybody for their birthday. So if you're listening to this, you're going to get this for your birthday. And please let me buy you lunch at some point. Or if you're ever in London, I definitely owe you a lovely lunch if you are up for it. So thank you so much for your time. You are wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Jess. You too. And I would love to have lunch in London one day. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really appreciate it. And may this at least spur your desire to make some sort of a difference in your workplace, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever, however you identify. You heard all the benefits that would ensue. So let's give it a go. Can't hurt, can it? I definitely recommend the book, obviously, the TED Talk, all of it. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone you think might like it or learn from it. Follow us on social media at the Big Vag Energy Pod and send any emails, suggestions, comments, questions to the Big Vag Energy Podcast at gmail.com. See you next time.